The Eight Precepts of Death are the main antagonists of Season 4 of My Hero Academia. Now, if you want to know more about their leader, then check out my Overhaul Explained in 2 minutes video. This video that you're currently watching will focus on the other members of the group, and will be running through their quirks all in about 5 minutes or less, with no plot spoilers. But before we begin, I'm nearly at 100 subs, so I would really appreciate it a lot if you would subscribe. The general manager of the Eight Precepts of Death is a guy called Mimic. Now, he does have a fantastic quirk, and for any one of you who's played the game Prey, then the concept of his quirk will be quite familiar to you. He can basically transfer his own body and mind into solid inanimate objects and then manipulate those objects as if those were his actual body. Now, under normal circumstances, his base quirk is usable on objects that are no bigger than the average sized fridge. But pay attention to this next part because it might get a bit confusing. We've established that when he's inside objects, he can essentially move them around as if they were his own body. But in that form, he is unable to perceive his surroundings. So imagine you transferred your consciousness into a football. You literally have no perception of reality. And so to get around this, Mimic manifests the relevant body part on the exterior of the object when necessary. So it's a good quirk, but if you don't have the relevant body parts manifested at the right time, it leaves you wide open to being attacked or taken by surprise. Now, moving on to Overhaul's direct assistant, that's a guy called Chronostasis. When I first saw Chronostasis unmasked, I genuinely thought it was a girl, but putting that aside, Chronostasis' quirk allows him to slow down the movements of anyone he hits with his weird extendable hair. However, he can't actually extend his hair unless he's standing perfectly still. Now, if you can see from this image, he has both a minute hand and an hour hand on his hair, and the duration of time for which his enemies are slowed down, basically like moving in slow motion, that depends on which hand he hits them with. Okay, so now we're moving on from the more senior characters to the lower members of the Eight Precepts of Death, specifically a group known as the Eight Expendables, which, if you're part of this group, is a pretty offensive name. Firstly, let's take a look at Kendo Rapper and Hejiki Tengai. These two have pretty complementary quirks, so I thought I'd do them together. Now, Rapper is the type of guy who never misses a gym session. He is absolutely massive. And his quirk, which is known as Strong Arm, allows him to rotate his shoulder sockets at extreme speeds. This basically allows him to dish out a constant stream of unrelenting punches. However, after a while he does actually need to stop, which leaves an opening for enemies to attack him. But this brings us to the reason why Tengai's quirk is complementary. Because while Rapper is all about attack, Tengai is all about defense. His barrier quirk allows him to create these telekinetic barriers which are comparable to the strength of a steel wall. So while it's not indestructible, it's incredibly hard to break it unless you have like All Might levels of strength. And unlike Rapper, Tengai actually keeps his emotions in check and has a pretty calm disposition. I think he was kind of designed to be a parody of a monk just by the way he like moves his hands around and talks. But moving on from these two characters, we have Shin Nemoto. He views himself as pretty special among the Eight Expendables, as he is the only one who Overhaul actually entrusted with his plans. So his quirk is called Confession, and it forces anyone he asks a question to answer truthfully. This is extremely useful to have in any organization, as you can ascertain people's true intentions very easily. However, whilst this quirk guarantees that people will tell him their truth, it doesn't guarantee that people will tell him the truth, if that makes sense. People can tell him what they perceive to be true, but if it's not true, then you've got false information. Now, because his quirk has no offensive capabilities, he normally stays strapped. Now, the next character up on the list is Dedoro Sakaki. Okay, that's actually the first time I've said that out loud. And he has a pretty undesirable quirk called Sloshed. And when I say undesirable, I don't mean that this quirk is necessarily bad, it's just not very exciting, like it's not something that I would want to have. So basically, Sloshed causes any person who approaches him to lose their sense of balance, very similar to the feeling of being drunk. He can essentially act as a type of stealth villain, because if he hides his presence, people will basically begin to feel the effects of his quirk without even knowing why, which would confuse the average person if they hadn't been drinking. His character design and his personality appears to reflect that of an alcoholic, which is pretty appropriate. Now, moving on from Sakaki, we have three expendables who are pretty closely linked, so I'm going to do them all together. And that is Hojo, Setsuno, and Tabe. Hojo's quirk is crystallization, and it grants him the ability to produce these really hard crystals all over his body. This is effective for both close range attacks and defense. Now we know that at some point in his life, he had a job of producing gems, and when the gems turned out to be worthless, he was discarded and found on the streets by Overhaul. In fact, Setsuno was another person found by Overhaul on the streets, and has a pretty awesome quirk called Larceny. His quirk would actually be really good for a hero. Larceny allows him to instantly move objects from the possession of someone else directly into his own hands, similar to teleportation. He primarily uses this power to disarm his opponents, turning them into easier targets for Hojo and Tabe to deal with. There's also a size limit on what he can steal from one person, with large enough objects being impossible to take away, and he's also unable to use his quirk on objects that he can't actually see, so if something's out of his line of sight, then he won't be able to use his quirk on it, meaning that he is completely defenseless if for some reason he is blinded or can't see. Now moving on to Tabe's quirk, this is another undesirable quirk that I definitely would not want, but it allows him to basically chew and eat anything that he comes into contact with. On top of that, his stomach is sturdy enough to digest pretty much anything he's eaten. However, if he does eat toxic substances, he will eventually get sick. But finally, the last member of the 8 Precepts of Death is Katsu Karma. His quirk is called Vitality Stealing, and it gives him the ability to absorb the stamina of others just by touching them. Now this quirk is actually really good, because it has the advantage of not just strengthening the user, but also weakening your enemies at the exact same time. And he can use other people's energy to increase his own size, which is possibly the reason why he's incredibly swole. Under normal circumstances, he needs to make contact, but if his quirk is awakened, then he can do it from a distance without even touching the people who he's stealing vitality from. And with Katsu Karma done, that is the entirety of the 8 Precepts of Death, with the exception of Overhaul. Now if you want to see my 2-minute explanation video on Overhaul, the link should be on the screen right now. But before you do that, please subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get 100 subscribers by the end of October, and I would really appreciate every single sub. I appreciate it, guys. Peace.